I'll just say a few words about the broader scope of my research, and then I have a PowerPoint, so I'll share my screen. But it is, Emery was suggesting, what it does is considers that problematic conflation of science and fiction in the cultural imaginary that drives the AI industry, and then that in turn has clouded some of the important social, political, and ethical questions that these technologies raise. So mostly I spend my time arguing that we need to revive the productive tension between science and fiction and reclaim the potential of fiction to cultivate an ethical imagination, so that fiction's not reduced to tech propaganda and science is not reduced to scientism. In other words, something that merely has the veneer of science. So let me just share my screen now. Okay, so an example of this scientism, so that's something that merely has the veneer of scientism, is Ray Kurzweil, who fantasizes that within a few decades, machine intelligence will surpass human intelligence, leading to the singularity. Technological change so rapid and profound, it represents a rupture in the fabric of human history. The implications include the merger of biological and non-biological intelligence, immortal software-based humans, and ultra-high levels of intelligence that expand outward into the universe. So for Donna Haraway, writing in the 1980s, Kurzweil's dream is more like a nightmare. The cyborg is also the awful apocalyptic telos of the West's escalating domination of abstract individualism and ultimate self-united at last from all this dependency and a man in space, she writes. While technology has long been presented as liberating humans, in reality, as de Cook and others have demonstrated, just because a place exists virtually and not materially does not release it from the colonial logics or practices. In fact, technology in virtual worlds are merely reflections of the physical material world and thus carries with it the same historical baggage of material spaces. As we've witnessed with the rise of big tech, that baggage not only replicates, but automates and accelerates global injustices. A character in Don DeLillo's novel White Noise observes about technology, creates an appetite for immortality on the one hand, and it threatens universal extinction on the other. Technology is lust removed from nature. So I'm just going to shrink that. Yeah. So this connection between lust for eternal life, long the realm of fiction, myth, and religion, and the annihilation of all life is no more in evidence than in the immortality industry. A thriving business in Silicon Valley, with the Bank of America predicting that this market will be worth $600 billion by 2025. Seemingly unfazed by the real science that documents things like deforestation, oil spills, acidifying oceans, melting permafrost, plastic pollution, overflowing landfills, the disappearance of birds and fish and animals, the plummet in insect life, and all the early stages of human-induced mass extinction. These titans of industry charge ahead with their unwavering faith in technological progress. Determined to make fiction come true, they build rockets, fill space with trash, dream of magical elixirs, fantasize about expanding the reach of their empires, and long to conquer the cosmos. In this talk, first I want to explore the far-reaching multi-billion-dollar tech industry or immortality industry, sorry, and the institutions and power behind the scenes that are fueling fantasy science. In the second part of this talk, I consider an episode of Black Mirror, Be Right Back from 2013, that resituates this science in fiction. While the tech industry is relentlessly focused on a future that is always future and never part of a past, the third section of this talk turns to consider archaeology by unearthing the future's archaic longings in one of the oldest surviving stories in the world, the Epic of Gilgamesh, that recounts the story of a tyrannical king and his quest for immortality. Drawing on the lesson in this ancient epic, I conclude with some reflections on the connection between mortality, responsibility, and freedom. Okay, so let me begin with one example of the immortality industry. The Avatar 2045 project was started by the soft-spoken Russian billionaire Dmitry Ishkoff in 2012. The operating ideology of this grand venture is, according to the website, the creation and realization of a new strategy for the development of humanity, which meets global civilization challenges, the creation of optimal conditions, promoting the spiritual enlightenment of humanity, and the realization of a new futuristic reality based on 5 principles: high spirituality, high ethics, high science, and high technologies. By 2020, that's this year, Ishkoff wants to develop a humanoid robot that can be controlled by a computer brain interface. By 2025, he wants to build an autonomous life support system for the human brain and transfer the brain to this avatar at the end of life. By 2035, he proposes to reverse engineer the brain, create an artificial brain, and transfer personality and consciousness to it. And by 2045, he promises to put conscious artificial brain in a hologram that can traverse the universe. If this sounds like fiction posing as science, that's because it is. One does not have to dig very deep to find scientists outside of the immortality industry who suggest, along with Elon Orbush, who's a professor of robotics at the Carnegie Mellon University, that Ishkoff's project is hogwash. Miguel Nicolas, who works on connecting paralyzed patients to machines to rewire their brains and to help them move again, is often cited as evidence of the possibility of projects like Avatar 2045. Nicolas himself, a professor of neuroscience at Duke University, insists that, quote, what people don't realize is that we're not talking about, not even in the distant future, of downloading someone's thoughts, emotions, memories, and passing that to another subject. That, in my opinion, is very unlikely to happen ever. And P.Z. Myers, a professor of evolutionary biology at the University of Minnesota, concurs and has dismissed the faith in reverse engineering the brain within a decade as profoundly ignorant, given that the brain is still largely a mystery, and also sees Kurzweil's claim that humans will live forever by 2029 as laughable. A professor of gerontology at USC, Walter Long, also points to the fantasy science hyped by tech executives. And he writes, there are lots of people talking about immortality. It's not about living to 110 or 120. It's about living to 1,000. You hear some really delusional talk from some really famous people. Moreover, the project seems to be running a little behind schedule on a number of fronts. In 2013, at the Global Future 2045 conference in New York City, the audience was promised the unveiling of a Dmitry Avatar A head, a robotic replica of Ishkoff's head. The head was to be built by David Hansen and Ben Kurzweil. Speaking of high ethics, Kurzweil, the chair of Humanity Plus, a transhumanist organization, has his $100,000 salary paid by the convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Hansen and Gertzel are also behind the robot Sophia that was granted Saudi citizenship and appeared at the UN, and that has been called out as a fraud and an animatronic puppet in the AI world. The unveiling of Ishkoff's head never happened at the Congress, and there's been no talk of it since, nor has the 2045 website been very active in the last couple of years. So I'm just going to play you a clip here of Ishkoff speaking at this New York conference in 2013.
Because in this future, people will be young, beautiful, they won't suffer from illnesses and diseases, and they will have, multiple bodies, not only just one. In the biological body, they will be able to probably live on Earth. In the non-biological body, they will be able to travel to cosmos. In the hologram-like body, people will be able to stay even there where you cannot stay in the...
So who is Ishkoff? In 2002, at the age of 22, he graduated with a degree in corporate management from the Plekhanov University of Economics. He made his money building the web-based media company New Media Stars with his infamous business partner, Konstantin Rykov, whom he met at the university. In the 90s, Rykov started a porn entertainment website with a swear word for a name, operated an online prostitution delivery service, and mastered the internet subculture of mixing crass jokes with scantily clad women, sports, entertainment, games, and nihilistic humor. New Media Stars graduated to the mainstream media in 2005 with a pro-Vladimir Putin online newspaper called Vzhlad. At the time of his inauguration in 2000, Putin largely controlled traditional media, but the online world was beyond his reach or understanding. Rykov was hired as the internet advisor to the Kremlin to help the president master it. Rewarded for unleashing bots and trolls, spreading misinformation, and flooding the internet with pro-Putin propaganda, Rykov was elected as a deputy of the Duma in the United Russia Party in 2007. He was also active at spreading disinformation campaigns when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and he started a pro-Trump website boasting he was responsible for the 45th victory in the 2016 American election. Ishkoff resigned from his position as CEO of New Media Stars in the spring of 2012 to work full-time on Immortality, but he published a piece in Vzhlad about the Russia 2045 project that listed 11 objectives, including flying cars, robot slaves, and climate-controlled domes. He promised that everyone would have young, beautiful avatars, be immortal, everything would be free, and there would be giant cities on the moon and Mars, and a dramatic increase in the Russian population due to what he called the State Children Program. The first man to be granted immortality under this grand project would be Putin, Ishkoff wrote. He also appealed to the then 1,126 people on the Forbes billionaire list to donate to his cause, promising them cybernetic immortality and artificial bodies and a world without disease, aging, and death. Offering to oversee the donor's personal immortality plan free of charge, Ishkoff added, "You also have the ability to finance the extension of your own life up to immortality." In this letter, all the assurances of high spirituality, high ethics, and high culture give way to the main thrust of the appeal, which is the business of immortality that he insists offers limitless profit. Contributing to cutting-edge innovations in the field of neuroscience, nanotechnology, and android robotics is more than building a brighter future for human civilization, but also a wise and profitable business strategy that will create a new vibrant industry of immortality, limitless in its importance and scale. This kind of investment will change every aspect of business as we know it, the pharmaceutical industry, transportation, medicine, energy generation, construction techniques, to cite a few. Envisioning endless business opportunities despite promises of everything being free, Ishkoff's immortality industry seems to take to heart the oft-quoted phrase, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." For those not on the Forbes billionaire list, Ishkoff also founded the Electronic Immortality Corporation, a social network that operates under the rules of a commercial company. This website, which boasts over 47,000 members, invites people to donate money or volunteer their time to his project. Okay, so my question is, why is a Russian oligarch with a shady track record and an undergraduate degree in commerce casting himself as he does as the new intellectual elite? And why does he see himself as the director of politicians, scientists, and the media? So I'll just play one more slide of Ishkoff.
Spread it worldwide. So I would like to address to politicians because they can and they need, obviously, even for themselves, to support our strategy, because the strategy will help us to organize the world as politicians claim they want it to be. So it will help us to create the humane and really free world. Then I would like to address public and social figures, because people really listen to them and they can help us to create some sort of social demand for the strategy. And then I would like to address to scientists, because they are actually the essential element in the strategy. They can help making the strategy real, feasible. And I want them to be a little bit more open, to those people like myself, and to help me to just not to be practical, but to help me probably to have a dream which is very rational and which has scientific support. And I would like to actually address the businessmen, because if we don't start investing in this sort of project right now, probably in the future, according to the biological limits, there will be just nothing to invest in.
More importantly, why have people taken them seriously? In a destructive cycle that both distracts from and contributes to the problems the world is facing, billionaires, the tech industry, and venture capitalists fund celebrity science, elite institutions back them, and the media outlets grant them credibility with clickbait headlines. The New York Times, The Independent, and the BBC, which produced a documentary on this project in 2016, have all lent it some degree of legitimacy by writing about it. A New York Times article concluded, quote, "If he succeeds, history will remember Mr. Ishkoff as a daring visionary whose money and energy redefine life in ways that solve some of the world's most intransigent problems." Joki Ito, the venture capitalist with no science degrees and the disgraced former head of the MIT Media Lab, was elected to the board of directors of the New York Times Company in 2012 for his digital expertise. So perhaps he was encouraging articles hyping fantasy technologies, as he had done with the help of Epstein at MIT. Why have professors, almost all men, from such elite institutions as Harvard, MIT, and Oxford lent support to this endeavor? Minsky and George Church, both implicated in the Epstein-MIT scandal, were two of the experts at the NYC conference. James Martin, tech evangelist, IT consultant, founder of the Oxford Martin School, the largest donation in Oxford's history, and owner of a private island, was also one of the speakers. The tech industry futurist and Google engineer Ray Kurzweil was also a featured guest, and celebrities from Steven Seagal, a friend of Putin's, to the Dalai Lama signed on to the project. Russians were early investors and students of Silicon Valley, a hub of transhumanism, and Ishkoff is joined by other white male multi-billionaires, Peter Thiel at PayPal, Larry Ellison at Oracle, Larry Page, Google co-founder and founder of the company Calico, which is dedicated to treating and solving death, treating aging and solving death, and Google invested 1.5 billion in that company. Sean Parker, co-founder of Napster, Sergey Brin, co-founder of Google, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, Pierre Almadar, founder of eBay, Paul F. Glenn, venture capitalist and investor, and Jeff Bezos of Amazon. They've all touted life extension and immortality after amassing fortunes in comparatively lowbrow schemes, selling ads, data theft, venture capital, stock investments, future tradings, database software management systems, social media platforms. These entrepreneurs, many preaching a drop out of school and get rich mantra, are now ready to take on death as if with a can-do confidence and money they can master it. The Andronian hero, beloved of Silicon Valley, trumpets free market fundamentalism and imagines himself as a genius standing above the mediocre crowd, ready to steer it into the future. Yet this story of tech giants with their record wealth, libertarian politics, and mastery of offshoring obscures their dependence not only on a tax-funded infrastructure and global planetary resources, but also on military backing and the massive transference of public funds to private industry that builds and continues to build Silicon Valley and other tech hubs, including those in Canada. Given the cutbacks in public funding to universities and non-industry sponsored science, academics are jumping on the life extension AI bandwagon, shaping their research agendas to meet the demands as they chase dollars. The list of experts on Ishkoff's website includes physicists, neuroengineers, and computer scientists. If the science is dubious, so too is the use of fiction in this field. Tech companies hire fiction writers to, quote, design the future, blurring the line between discovering the world and imagining it, and between fact and fiction. Ishkoff and others in AI pepper their comments with references to fiction as if it were predictive and on the verge of being realized. They mine fiction for inspiration and innovation while ignoring its formal structures, literary tropes, historical situatedness, and cultural context. Ishkoff himself lists Surrogates as a favorite film because it features a Geminoid, a teleoperated robot that looks like his owner, designed by the Japanese roboticist Hiroshi Ishiguro, one of the experts listed on the 2045 website. In the film, however, these machines prove addictive and suck the life out of humans, which could serve as an allegory for the well-documented strategies of social media platforms that learn from the gambling industry how to keep eyeballs glued to the screen to increase profits. Fiction writers are hired by tech firms, and fiction is corralled into doing the marketing work for technology for its cool factor, while overly literal readings of fiction forcefully shut down the ethical questions it raises. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this exploitation of fiction by industry. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, two of the wealthiest men in the world, attribute their space ambitions to growing up with Star Trek. Set in a fictional galaxy of spaceships, talking computers, holographs, transporters, time travel, and populated by androids, a holographic doctor, the extra-dimensional beings of the Q continuum, the cybernetic organisms that make up the Borg, Romulans, Klingons, and Vulcans, and other extraterrestrial races. This show shaped these rivals' view of the future. As adults, they both express their frustration with the current state of interplanetary travel, and so they both have plans for colonizing space with their companies Blue Origin and SpaceX. Yet the TV series that has inspired these grand plans was never about literal space travel. Gene Roddenberry, influenced by Jonathan Swift's 18th century Gulliver Travels, was not envisioning some realizable future any more than Swift believed there were nations of 6-inch people or talking horses or flying islands waiting to be discovered. Rather, Roddenberry insisted the show was about learning from the past in order to inform the present, with each episode offering up a moral. Emerging from the counterculture of the 60s, Roddenberry used allegory to write about the concerns of his era. This is a quote from him. I could make statements about sex, religion, Vietnam, politics, and intercontinental missiles. Indeed, we did make them on Star Trek. We were sending messages, and fortunately, they all got by the network. If you talked about purple people on a far off planet, the television network, never really caught on. Unfortunately, Bezos and Musk also seem to never have caught on. Hoping to make the colonizing of space a reality, the cost of banishing the fictiveness of fiction gives way to the unreflective repetition of an already exhausted economic model. Ignoring Star Trek's critique of capitalism and imperialism, these industry heads insist on accelerating and expanding current business practices. They're unable to imagine a system that's moved beyond libertarian politics, market growth, entrepreneurs, resource exploitation, and wealth disparity, as if history had ended, trapping humanity in what is, after all, a relatively recent economic structure and leaving us mired in the too familiar tropes of heroic white men conquering worlds. If fiction, stripped of any context, has been dressed up and branded as science by industry, several contemporary fictions have in turn exposed this science as fiction. Be Right Back, a 2013 episode, the first in the second series of Black Mirror, explores an Ishkoff-like plan to transfer personalities to avatars. The episode begins with a young, happy couple, Martha and Ash, who move into a house in the country. As they are conversing in a car, Ash is absorbed by his cell phone, and his partner complains that he keeps, quote, vanishing down that thing. The next day, he literally vanishes from her life when he dies in a car crash. Devastated and overwhelmed by grief, Martha also discovers she's pregnant, and she's advised by a friend to connect with Ash via a business that harvests online profiles and sells them back to grieving family members. But it's not him, she protests, while her friend tells her, no, but it helps. Soon Martha is completely absorbed by these electronic remnants as she converses with her digital lover on the phone, though he doesn't have a mouth, and she too vanishes down the internet, disconnecting from her friends and family. Offered the next level of service with its accompanying costs, Martha hesitantly agrees. Within days, formless synthetic muscle arrives at her door, and once activated, a replica of Ash constructed from data harvested from online sites and flattering internet photos emerges from the chemical bath. The avatar's skin is perfect and disturbingly smooth, with no fingerprints and no distinguishing details. The avatar does not breathe and has no need for food or sleep. It does not bleed and it cannot move beyond 25 meters of its activation point. It cannot parse difficult sentences, it performs without thinking, and it has no history outside Ash's limited and curated social media profile that has been mined for profit. For instance, there is no online record of Ash's sexual performance, though the replica can turn on its penis and has downloaded routines lifted from porn videos. It also doesn't recognize Martha's sister. The liminal figure, this liminal figure, perfectly encapsulates the fate of humans under surveillance capitalism. As Sojana Zuboff writes, humans are not the product, but rather the discarded husks under this regime. The human is cast aside while their online data lives on as a lucrative resource for corporations. Increasingly irritated with this commodity, a hollow simulation, Martha tells it to jump off a cliff, which it's willing to do until she protests that the real Ash would have objected. Readily adaptable, it dutifully complies and refuses to jump off as it does whatever she wants. It has no interiority, no singular life force, and no desire. It obeys its owner. Martha finally puts it in the attic where the kid, now 7, visits the only father she's ever known on weekends and birthdays while her mother weeps below. Ishkoff says believes that he can extract a little homunculus, a little I inside of us, which he can separate from the body and transfer to artificial bodies.
There is I inside of us, and this I interacts with the body, and through the body has a perception of the outer world, of the external world, material world. And this new artificial body can be just the other intermediary.
Yet, like Ash, whose data is stolen and sold, this I will inevitably completely vanish in the process, as thinking, desire, will cannot be translated into code. Ishkoff's limitless and vibrant industry of immortality will produce nothing more than information that's commodifiable, reproducible, and manipulable. An ironic fate for the tech fans of the autonomous, free-loving, individualistic Randian hero. Frederick Jameson, in Archaeologies of the Future, The Desire Called Utopia, and Other Science Fiction, argues that science fiction expresses, quote, the most archaic longings of the human race, while Adam Roberts contends that science fiction itself dates back to ancient Greece. The next section of this paper returns to a text that is still older, but that is in keeping with the genre, as it's about technology, extraordinary travels, civilization, the cosmos, and the quest for immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest written story anywhere, most likely based on a real king who lived during the first half of the 3rd millennium, and the poems that were written about him for at least thousands of years after his death. The epic was first collected and edited in about 1200 BCE from the clay tablets that circulated during the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Neo-Assyrian empires. It was copied by students right up to the Roman Wars and then disappeared entirely until clay tablets were discovered in the mid-19th century. Scholars worked for decades deciphering the cuneiform script, and clay tablets are still being discovered in the ancient cities of the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, though the 21st century wars in the Middle East have interfered with these archaeological digs. And this is just the tablet of the flood, which is particularly famous because it predates Noah, the biblical story of Noah and the flood, even though, of course, and the biblical story, which is, of course, after this story. So at the outset of the story, Gilgamesh, a king and demigod, mistreats his subjects. He picks fights with young men, claims the right to bed brides on the day of their marriage. The people are fed up with their irresponsible, tyrannical king, and so they appeal to the gods for help. The gods create Enkidu out of clay. He lives peacefully with the animals, quote, his heart delighting with the wild beasts, until a hunter complains that Enkidu is destroying his traps. And so a temple prostitute is sent out to seduce Enkidu. And after they couple, the animals reject him. But as compensation for this loss, he gains language, cognition, reason, and wide understanding. And this delicate balance between civilization and nature that opens this epic runs through it. Angered by the king's unnatural claims to the brides on their wedding night, Enkidu, still motivated by the same sense of justice that led him to free the animals, comes to the defense of the women and challenges Gilgamesh to a fight. Gilgamesh is happy to have met his equal, and they both become fast friends. But despite the warnings of Enkidu and the elders, the king continues with his unnatural conquests and insists on fighting Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, so that he can cut down the majestic cedars and establish his name, as he says, for all eternity. Fearing that the god Enlil will hear of their deed, Enkidu and Gilgamesh slay Humbaba, even as the guardian of the forest begs for his life. Humbaba in turn curses them, threatening that the pair will not grow old together. The desire for mastery over nature drives Gilgamesh, and he ignores the curse and continues to upset the cosmic order. Gilgamesh, full of pride and thinking himself without limits, declares himself, quote, the most glorious of fellows. Humbaba's curse, however, comes to pass, and as the gods decide Enkidu must die for these transgressive acts, driven mad with grief over the death of his friend whom he mourns for days, and this is from the poem, till a maggot falls from one of Enkidu's nostrils, Gilgamesh is finally both humbled and terrified as he reflects on his own mortality. Shall I not be like him, he thinks, casting off his trappings as king as he heads off to the ends of the earth in search of the immortal Uptanapishti, who has survived the great flood and saved life from complete destruction. After many trials, Gilgamesh comes to the waters of death, crosses the waters of death, and finds Uptanapishti, whom he hopes will teach him the secret of immortality. Gilgamesh is given the challenge of going without sleep for 6 days and 7 nights, but falls fast asleep almost immediately, causing Uptanapishti to comment to his wife, "See the fellow who so desired life." Gilgamesh and his selfish pursuit of immortality and personal greatness pale against Uptanapishti, who has saved the earth and all living beings. The immortal asks Gilgamesh, given he lacks the fortitude for immortality, why he is spending his fleeting life chasing sorrow, reminding him of the responsibilities of being a king. So on arrival back in Uruk, the king restores the rights of the cosmos and restores it restores the rights of the cosmos for the people. At the heart of this epic, then, is the transformation of Gilgamesh from a selfish tyrant to a wise king who comes to care for his people. Rather than heroic feats and battles, Gilgamesh's biggest challenge is to learn how to live as an ethical human, and that requires accepting his mortality. It is the death of his friend, whom he considers an equal, that opens Gilgamesh to an ethical stance and a sense of fellowship. As long as he imagines himself invincible and apart from the cosmos, greatness eludes him. Only when he understands that he's connected to all mortals and shares their fate is he able to do great things. Grief expands Gilgamesh, turning him from an abusive, egocentric ruler who's despised by his subjects to a responsible human. Surpassing all other kings, he records this tale about nature, civilization, consciousness, transformation, and mortality that has lasted through the centuries. So let me just conclude here with a few reflections on this, on the ethics of death. So grief and loss trigger the desire for immortality in these stories. Ash perishes in a car accident, and the market exploits his partner's desire to have him back. Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh confronts his own mortality. Amongst the transhumanists, the sudden death of his father motivated Kurzweil's desire for the singularity, the merging of man and machine, convinced, as he says, that he can bring his father back. Alan Turing, the force behind theoretical computer science, artificial intelligence, and the universal Turing machine, was devastated by the loss of his classmate, Christopher Morcom, with whom he had fallen deeply in love. Morcom died suddenly in 1930, triggering Turing's obsession with information that would survive the body. The thought of death terrifies Ishkoff and others in Silicon Valley, whom he sees as pointless. Is there a point to death? The Gift of Death, which is 2008. In it, Derrida, following Heidegger, writes of death as guaranteeing the singularity of the human. In other words, your death can only be your own. No one can die for you, and you cannot take another's death. One death cannot be exchanged for another death. He writes, everyone must assume his own death. That is to say, the one thing in the world that no one else can either give or take. Therein resides freedom and responsibility. Even if one gives me death to the extent that it means killing me, that death will still not have been mine. And as long as it's irreducibly mine, I will not have received it from anyone else. Thus, dying can never be taken, borrowed, transferred, delivered, promised, or transmitted. And just as it can be given to me, so it can't be taken away from me. Oh, sorry. Remove death from the equation, and what is left is infinitely exchangeable. But the very thing that's longed for, the continuation of the singular I, the thing that cannot be substituted for another, vanishes completely. The digital ash and be right back is stripped of everything that might mark him as an individual life. The quest for immortality, in order not to be replaced by the next generation, paradoxically concludes with it being endlessly replaceable. Not only is identity as singular and unique granted in death, argues Derrida, but also that therein resides freedom and responsibility. The digital ash under the command of its owner has no freedom. Gilgamesh only becomes a responsible king when he accepts his mortality. Ishkoff and his fellow tech billionaires who dream of evading death and colonizing the cosmos and escaping to other planets refuse the responsibility for the state of this planet. So perhaps it is not nature in its unmappable complexity and diversity that spills off in all directions that constrains humans, as the techno-utopians insist, but rather, as Amitav Ghosh has argued, the Western tendency to silence all our relatives, the trees, the oceans, the animals, to imagine ourselves as apart from nature, which has left us boxed into this deadly trajectory of a mechanistic modernity and landed us in a planetary crisis long in the making. Thank you.